This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. This is an underreported area of investigation and activity. Big multinational corporations and their business practices, not just at home, but in particular abroad, where there's often less legal oversight and it's easier to, bribe your way to deals. Particularly because of how C-suites in this country have become indistinguishable from college campuses. A lot of preening, a lot of moralizing, a lot of virtue signaling. And then when you're not looking, when their corporate comms department isn't pressing profile, how they're actually behaving in advance of their pecuniary interests. So this book, Kickback, by David Montero, has me intrigued. Kickback, Exposing the Global Corporate Bribery Network. David Montero is formerly a correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor and a producer for PBS's series Frontline. He has twice been honored with Emmy Award nominations, as well as the South Asian Journalists Association's Daniel Pearl Award. Montero is an LA Times national correspondent now. And again, the book Kickback, Exposing the Global Corporate Bribery Network. David, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you have examples in the book that zero in on Fortune 500 companies that enjoy, relatively hands-off approach from the political and investigative press corps, and I want to hear about the big pharma companies and others and what they're doing overseas that perhaps would shock the consciences of some of their employees, much less the public at large.
Yeah, for the last 10 years, many big pharmaceutical companies, as you mentioned, names that we know, Pfizer, Eli Lilly, Bristol Myers Squibb, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, they have been paying bribes to doctors, countless doctors throughout China. China is one of their biggest markets. It's a market that has kept them in business when their stocks have declined in the West and in the United States. So they made this big push into China by paying often small bribes. Sometimes they bribe doctors with cigarettes or eyeglasses or promises to send doctors to Disneyland on junkets. And these doctors were induced to overprescribe medicine that people often didn't need, like antibiotics. And China, as a result, has one of the highest rates of overprescription of antibiotics in the world. I'm not the one who said that Pfizer and Novartis and Bristol Myers Squibb did this. The SEC and the Justice Department settled investigations with all these companies in the last few years, and they've paid more than $100 million in fines collectively to settle those investigations.
And it's just kind of continue to develop that. So the net effect of these investigations have found what in terms of not just the actual transaction, but the impact of that transaction, the human cost?
Well, that's a very interesting thing. These investigations almost never look at the impact of these bribes. The reason for that is that the Justice Department and the SEC, it's not within their mandate to go and follow the money and figure out, well, what did these bribes do? So the SEC and the Justice Department prosecute this crime as if it were just any kind of white-collar crime. That basically these companies are fined for filing false paperwork. Mm-hmm. It's up to a journalist like me to go to China and figure out, well, what actually happens when Pfizer and Eli Lilly bribe countless doctors throughout the country to prescribe medicine. So sadly, these settlements in a sense buy silence on the issue of the impact. But by going to the countries where the bribes are paid, as I did, and speaking to doctors and patients and the Chinese government even, which is very upset about these bribes, and has been cracking down on it, that's where you learn what the impact is.
You know, for your next book, you can come to Chicago and do a book about political kickbacks. Does that ever interest you?
Well, that does, but they're all legal, of course, in the United States. You know,
Yeah.
Abroad, this is illegal. It's bribery. In the United States, it's called lobbying.
Right, exactly. Well, a fair
Yep.
point. And it's good to make sure people understand that Paul Manafort is not the only person out there, perhaps in violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Here's the question, though, about impact. I assume the drug companies will say, David, well, it's not bribery. Here's what we're doing. We're incentivizing doctors to use our version of a particular medicine over a competitor's version, but they're going to use that medicine, and that medicine is used properly. It's just our brand versus their brand, and so that's just incentivizing the use of one substitute over the other.
Yes, right. But I spoke to doctors themselves who had been bribed and who told me there's a real danger. Of course, these doctors claim I didn't overprescribe this antibiotic. I mean, we want to believe them. But they felt that doctors that they knew were definitely overprescribing things because it's how they made their salary. The doctors are paid so little in China. They felt like they couldn't really take care of their families unless they were getting these kickbacks, and in return, they overprescribed. I spoke to drug reps who worked for huge European companies who told me, yeah, I have doctors who they're overprescribing so much, and we know it because we track their prescriptions every month, that we had to kind of tell them to stop. You know, they were kind of sometimes the overprescriptions were so high that we felt like maybe they should not be prescribing as much. So I understand the companies will say that, but that's just I think it's a facile argument.
And how are the offers made? I mean, do they go to their office or do they go to their homes? Do they meet them on a park bench? How does this work?
Yeah, they go to their. So this one doctor I met told me every month 2 reps would come to my office and they would talk to me about how their product is much better than the competition's, and that they would support me if I supported them. And so then every month, after she agreed to do that, and she agreed to do this for about a year, to take bribes in return for prescriptions, the reps would come every month and sit in her office, and they would give her $50. It wasn't a lot of money, but that was just one drug company that was paying her off. So yeah, they come, they sit, they would pass her the money, and then they would say thank you. And I remember she laughed in our interview when she told me that, because she thought it was so funny how they were thanking her for her corruption every month.
What about companies that do business with despotic regimes? And I mean more than just do business, you know, really facilitate, if not underwrite, human rights abuses and other dictatorial practices in foreign countries?
Yeah, exactly. So in China, we're talking about bribery kind of on a very small level, right? The amount of money is small, and the doctors don't have that much power or influence. But then again, bribery often takes place on a very grand scale. So a very good example, which I document in the book, is Alcoa, a Fortune 500 company, the largest aluminum manufacturer in the world, and the $130 million in bribes it paid to the royal family of Bahrain. In the period leading up to the Arab Spring, when citizens throughout the Middle East were protesting against the corruption, you know, this very kind of corruption that they were upset about, that their rulers were engaging in, Alcoa was doing this. It used a middleman to pay all these bribes to allegedly the prime minister of the country, and then several very powerful sheikhs. And the royal family of Bahrain is very well documented as being a human rights abuser. They're abusing especially religious minorities. When the Arab Spring took place, they violently crushed the uprisings in the street, and dozens of people died. I think hundreds of people were jailed. And so the bribes that Alcoa paid kept this regime in power, and kept them in power because they want to keep receiving these bribes. How they use that money to directly stifle dissent, we don't know, but we can assume that it's a pillar of their support. Hundreds of millions of dollars of bribes help them stay in power and do whatever they want.
I want to get your sort of handle on Greece as well, because you use Greece as an example of corporations outsourcing bribery to sort of hired guns, super agents, so the Greek economy sort of mirrors what's happening in Illinois. So and the use of super agents too from the political class too. It sounds very familiar. So I'm interested to hear that story.
Yeah, I mean, as we know, Greece is in economic turmoil, just recovering from that. One of the reasons that Greece is in this turmoil is because it overspent so much on healthcare. And one of the reasons it overspent so much on healthcare is because, like in China, doctors, surgeons were being bribed to use products they didn't need, or even in surgery, they were using products, maybe more screws and orthopedic screws than they needed. A lot of the major orthopedic companies, including Johnson & Johnson, Smith & Nephew, they all used the same agent in Greece to do this. This was a well-established businessman in Greece who had relationships with all the top doctors in the country. And it was a very turnkey solution for a company like Dupuis, a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, their orthopedic subsidiary, to go to this guy and say, well, we want our product in the market, and we know that we have to compete against Smith & Nephew, and you pay bribes on behalf of Smith & Nephew, but we want you to pay them on our behalf now. And so that's what he did. He set up relationships. He set up fake bank accounts around the world, and he funneled money from his various shell companies in England to these bank accounts, and then from the bank accounts to thousands of doctors. It was kind of a huge operation to do this.
And is the reason that there's so few prosecutions of executives at these big companies just because of the complicated nature, the time, how time-consuming it is, how expensive it is for justice to bring cases against them, and so in some respects they're above the law because of their influence and money and power?
Well, what the Justice Department told me, many people told me, is that it's exceedingly difficult to prove the intent of an individual in any criminal case, but particularly in a bribery case. Why? Because the act took place abroad, the evidence is often abroad, and the witnesses who can speak to that evidence are often abroad. So according to the Justice Department, it's very time-consuming, resource-consuming to get that evidence. You may have to go to a place like Nigeria and ask for bank statements. The banks may not comply. Even if you get those bank statements, which could take months, you then may need to bring a witness into, if this goes to trial, you would need to bring a witness into the courtroom to say, well, these are what the bank accounts mean and why the jury should care. A witness may not be able to, they may not be able to find a witness. The witness may not cooperate. So from their standpoint, it's a resource issue. I do think, however, that if they wanted to, they could continue to spend their resources. Part of the problem is the Justice Department doesn't like to lose at trial. It has suffered some pretty bad public losses at trial when in bribery cases, and I think since then they've been a little bit gun-shy, or you might even say quite gun-shy, about trying to bring a case which is difficult against an executive only to have it fail, and then embolden other executives to say, well, great, I'll go to trial too next time, and I'll fight this, and maybe it'll collapse, because it's difficult to gather the evidence and then to present it to a jury and make them understand how this one person was particularly liable.
Really interesting. David Montero is the author. He's an LA Times national correspondent. The book is Kickback, Exposing the Global Corporate Bribery Network. David, thanks for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer.